I was a teenager during the civil rights movement and the riots that ensued after the assassination of Martin Luther King. So I remember it very well. And when I was a junior in high school, and I had finally gotten excited about taking history. I had a history teacher that really made it interesting to me. But one day during all of the riots and everything, I was the only Black person in the class. When I was in high school, I was the only Black person in every class except gym and lunch. And so I'm sitting there, and Mr. Allen said to the class, yes, there are some changes that need to happen. It's time, but Black people need to be patient. And it was at that moment that I had rage like I had never had rage before, but I wasn't courageous enough to say anything to him in front of the whole group. And so what I said to him after the class was, Mr. Allen, when you were born as a white baby, did you have to be patient for your freedom? And he thought about it. He didn't really answer. I don't really even remember what he said as an answer, but I watched his behavior, his comments, because he was my favorite teacher at the time, for the rest of that year and through my senior year. So something happened in that moment that made him reframe how he even looked at this. And that's how I'm feeling again through all of what's happening at this moment. So I knew I wanted and needed to have this forum. And I also knew that I wanted and needed to have a colleague, an ally, someone who has done some work in diversity and inclusion, but most importantly, someone that understands this in many levels. So my colleague for this afternoon is Gary Rifkin. He is the Chief Learning Officer for Core Clarity. I'll let him tell you a little more about that if he chooses to. But I really know him even before he was with Core Clarity. He and I are both professional speakers, and we've known each other for several years. So earlier we figured out that between the two of us, we have about 60 years of experience in doing this work in one way or another. Of course, we won't have all the answers. You'll have many of them. And it's my hope that we'll be able to share all of that. So I would like to ask Gary to introduce himself in a little more depth and to share with you how you, Gary, have come to be in this space, because it happened very early for you.
Yeah, well, first I have to say that my heart is really heavy with what's been going on in our world. And so I was so honored that Lenora asked me to be a part of this today. My background is kind of basic. I'm a white guy, grew up in a small town with parents who were teachers. So they taught us, I think, really great values. I didn't really know what I didn't know until I got to college. And in college, I started to experience not only people who were different from me, because I was used to that, but things that got me to think differently. And I remember the big moment for me was seeing a movie, a video. Back then, they put in a videotape of this third grade school teacher from Iowa. The tape was called The Eye of the Storm, and it was a PBS documentary where she had separated the kids in her class by eye color and treated the kids based on their eye color differently to teach them about how easy it is to fall into a space of separating people and putting them down. And it blew my mind. And it helped me to realize a lot of things I didn't understand. And that started a journey of me really wanting to help people understand differences, understand how we can be one community and yet be fully a diverse, wonderfully inclusive community. And so I became a white guy teaching other people, but especially being able to talk to white guys about this topic. I found that when I would co-facilitate a diversity class with an African-American woman, we made this great balanced couple because she was able to speak from a standpoint of an experience of being Black in this country. And I was able to speak from an experience of not being Black. And there were people that would listen to me that wouldn't listen to her. And there were people that would listen to her that wouldn't listen to me. So that was really huge for me. But then the big aha for me that has really plagued me recently, and Lenora and I talked about this the other day, is that when I show up, I get to choose what I share. And so for many years as a diversity educator, I didn't tell people that I was raised Jewish. I, especially in working in Christian organizations, didn't want people to judge me. So I didn't share that. I didn't share with people that I was gay. I didn't lie. I didn't offer that I had a wife, but I didn't talk, none of my stories revolved around that. And I had that choice. And African Americans have never had that choice. And that was a big aha for me just recently, that for me, that's almost a piece of the what people call white privilege. And I know we'll talk about that more later, but that has been a big eye opener for me. And I'm going to leave it at that, only to say that as I moved from doing purely diversity work and some other work, I moved into this world where I'm now working with Core Clarity, where we help people understand their own unique gifts and how they can use those gifts on their team to be most effective. What it does is it helps me to begin to realize that the differences that I have with people, yes, there's many that are physical and visible, but many of them are internal. And I'm learning how to really appreciate those in ways that I don't think I could have in my 30s and 40s. So.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Gary. So what our process will be is we want to spend several minutes just answering your questions and hearing your comments. So they don't all have to be questions, but your comments, your experiences, to the degree that we can do that. And then we want to make sure that we spend a good amount of time giving ideas on things that you can do, actions that you can take. Silence is no longer acceptable. And as I've had conversations with people, some have said, well, you know, whatever was said or done, it wasn't directed at me, so I didn't think I was supposed to speak up. And the other thing I would ask for this session is that we keep it focused on racism and African Americans specifically. Now, I did ask Gary intentionally because I know that he represents several diversities. However, to Gary's point,
and short people, just saying.
And short, right? And I knew, just as he said, you know, as a white guy, he can say some things that won't be heard if I say it, and vice versa. And the reason that I want to keep it very focused on racism today is my experience is that I have found that very often when a racism issue comes up or a bias about Black people comes up, my perception is when a white person is hearing it, my perception is they intend to show empathy. That's what they're really wanting to do. But what they do is some, of course not everybody, but after they hear this story, this thing that happened to a Black person, they then say one of two things. Either, well, you know, I really don't think that was racism. Maybe they had a bad day, which discounts what was just shared with them. Or they say, you know, I'm gay, or I'm a lesbian, or I'm whatever it is, and so I understand. And even though your intentions might be good, when you do that, rather than just listen to what the person had enough courage to share with you, for many, it lands on them in a way that says, you're discounting my experience. And as Gary was saying, is you don't necessarily have to unveil whatever your difference is. But for African Americans, we don't have that choice. If we wanted to have that choice, we don't have that choice. And even for other people of color, when other people of color say, I understand, I'm there with you. In this country, it was Black people who were enslaved. And that has been the chains dragged through this country for several hundred years at this point. No other group has had that in their history. So although today we're saying, well, you know, I wasn't the person that enslaved anyone, it has impacted our culture. It has impacted how we see one another. And so that's something that's very different. And I think that's why, one of the reasons why there is so much pain being felt right now. What I would like to ask you, so I'll put it out now and I'll certainly say it at the end, is if you would like more of these forums to happen, that I can certainly make it a series, then make sure you let us know that through your chats, and where we can focus on, you know, many different aspects of inclusion. And we really want to focus this one on what actions you could take, actions you could take as a human being, actions you could take as an individual, as a colleague, as a family member, and as an executive. So we hope to get all that covered. I'm going to stop talking because I see some questions coming in. So let's see, Jen, are you going to share with us a question?
Well, and you got one already.
Oh yes, you know what?
We were going to start with, right?
Thank you. Let me start with this one, even before we get to that. So Mickey, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but for privacy, I'm not going to say your last name, sent an email to me before we began and asked a question that I thought so much speaks to what a lot of people are feeling. So I'm going to read it to you, and then Gary and I will attempt to provide some answers. What Mickey says is, I'm looking forward to our discussion this afternoon. One question I have is, how do white people communicate to Black people that they are in fact empathic, non-racist, and open to communication? That's the question. I have worked on this my whole life as a white person, but don't know how it's being perceived necessarily. I try to make contact with people of color as I walk by them on the street by giving them eye contact and a smile. I try to make sure in meetings that people of color are offered the opportunity to speak, among a myriad of other things. Still, I'm white, and I can't change people's preconceived ideas of me as privileged without responsibility to others. So what can I do? Well, since I read the question, Gary, I think I'll let you take a stab at it first.
Oh, great. I get to jump right in. I think the biggest word that we can remind ourselves over and over again is listen. We have a tendency in our culture to listen to respond instead of to listen to understand. And I have found that as I try to listen to people, if I go in with the, well, I know what you're feeling, so as soon as you start to tell me, I can jump right in with my response, I'm being disrespectful. And by the way, I'm speaking personally because this is what I tend to do. And I have to stop myself and say, wait a minute, do I understand where this person is coming from? And the answer to that has to be no, because I can't possibly understand exactly where you're coming from, which means it's on me to ask, and to ask with empathy and with patience. And then it's on you to know that I'm asking out of a desire to understand and not out of a challenge, which means we have to listen for understanding instead of with a preparation to challenge. That's my first thought.
Yes. And what comes to my mind is you're trying so hard, and that's wonderful. So when you have those moments that you're not quite sure if you're being perceived the way you intend, then my suggestion would be that you take that person aside. Like you said, you pull people into conversation in meetings. And I see this happening constantly in organizations where some people are not heard at all, or they're heard, but then they're dismissed. So it's wonderful that you pull them in, or that, you know, like you're not going to pull a stranger aside when you're smiling at them and you're walking down the street. But if it is somebody that you would have the opportunity to have a conversation with, just be vulnerable, be willing to say, you know, Gary, I really want to support you. I really hear you. I really, you know, want you to participate. I'm not sure if I'm doing it the right way, but can you tell me if it is working for you? And then be quiet. So be willing to say, I don't know if I'm doing this right for you, whatever, whoever the individual is, because each of us is a culture of one. Part of who we are is, in this case for me, I'm African American. That's one small part of who I am. But if I were to name several categories. All of us are in those categories. You're just in a different place. And so no two of us are the same. Each is a culture of one. So we also want to be careful that we don't go to just one person,
Right.
an African American in this case, and say, well, tell me what you think. Now, in my case, when I was saying earlier, I appreciate that my clients and my friends are reaching out to me, but that's because they know the work that I do. What I'm saying is, in general, don't assume that one Black person is going to be able to tell you how to act or tell you what to do, because none of it is going to be perfect. And you're going to make mistakes. I've been doing this a long time, and every now and then I open mouth and insert foot.
Right.
And then I just own it because it shows that I'm human.
And I think that's a big key to it too, is that we are all on this kind of learning journey. And if we are willing to be on the journey together, then we start to get better. And we continue and continue and continue to get better. A side point is something that I've always talked about in a variety of settings, is learn how to balance honesty and tact. Mm. And that might mean that there will be certain settings where tact goes out the window, and you got to be really honest and direct. And if that's what they need to get hit over the head, then that's what they need. Now, not literally hit over the head, but there are also times where you need to raise the tact and kind of soften the direct honesty. Now, that doesn't mean to be dishonest, but if I can come to you from a really tactful place and ask the question in that way, if I can ask the question, instead of saying, why do you do this? Saying, I'm sure there's a reason for this. And you know that I have not walked in your shoes. Can you help me understand why you do this? Why whatever? And don't make assumptions.
Yeah.
I think that makes a huge difference.
So just keep open. Okay, so I'm seeing all these questions going through the chat. So I am going to turn it to Jen to ask us the first question you're reading.
Lenora?
Patrice? Or Jen? Who's going to ask me a question first? Jen, you're muted. Okay, let's see. Jen, there we go. Jen, do you have a question?
Lenora, this is Patrice.
I'm here. I wasn't sure if
So
was trying to chime in.
Whoops, hold on one second. Patrice is talking. So we'll let Patrice, because we can't see her. Patrice, what, go ahead.
Okay, one of the questions is, how can I explain to white people when they use all lives matter, so many do not understand what Black Lives Matter means exactly?
Yes. That's such a great question, because it seems to be confusing to so many people. When Black people say Black Lives Matter, they are not saying nobody else's life matters. They're not saying that at all. It's saying, given what we know is systematic racism, given what we see happening to our Black men, our Black boys, and frankly, Black women and girls that have been killed either by police or in some other way, when all they did was show up and be Black. When we see that so much, we need to say our lives matter. And so when people say all lives matter, of course they do. But white people are not getting killed in the same way that Black people are. And as long as we keep trying to make it comfortable for everyone, the change won't happen. And frankly, change doesn't happen until we get uncomfortable with the status quo. So I think what is happening right now in our country is people of all ethnicities, of all genders, of all ages are marching in our country and in the world because they're tired of the status quo. So just know that we're not excluding, we're just saying we need to pay attention to this. And so I'll jump on quickly something that similar to that has been very misunderstood. People constantly say, well, no, athletes and others should not take a knee when the anthem is being played, because that's disrespectful to the flag and disrespectful to our military. When they say that, they absolutely do not get it at all. It is not disrespectful to the flag. The flag is supposed to be a representation of supporting all of us. And it's a way of saying, all of us are not represented. It's not disrespectful to the flag, and certainly not disrespectful to the men and women who are serving in our military and in all the other ways that people protect us. But it is a way to say, enough is enough. We need to bring attention to it. And it takes courage to do that, because as you know, the football player whose name is going out of my head at the moment, Kaepernick, you know, you see the consequences of being courageous. Okay.
Can I add something to
Yes.
that, Lenora?
Yes.
Because I don't want to go through like all the political discussions, except to say this. When people have said what he meant was blah, 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 I'd rather them go to what he actually said he meant. He told us why he was kneeling. He told us that he respected the military, that he respected the Constitution, and that he needed to speak out, and that's what he was doing. And I think that's the case for all of us, is we have to listen to people. When they tell us what they mean, we need to believe them. I think that's true across the board.
And you know, how often do we hear people say, well, I know what you're thinking? Or I'm like, really? It's like, I'm pretty good, but I don't know if you could read my mind.
And I want to go back to the Black Lives Matter, Lenora, because I can think back to being in college and some of my peers going, I don't understand why they have a Black student union. Why don't we have a white student union? And that was the starter of all of this for many of us when we were young. And I remember struggling with that at first. And then I remember saying to somebody, everything is a white student union. Do you not understand that? And they said, well, that's not true. And I said, it's your perspective that that's not true. But the reality to a Black student is that it is true, that the union is not designed, the specialty groups are not designed to invite and include them in.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Okay.
Also have another question.
Okay, Patrice, can we have Jen ask a question? There's several in Zoom. So we're gonna, yeah. Okay, great, thanks. Jen?
I wanted to share a couple of comments, not so much as questions, but that I thought would kind of piggyback on what you're talking about. One is that, yes, absolutely what you mentioned at the beginning, everybody wants more forums like this, which I think speaks volumes about everyone's confusion and need for understanding of how to address it. Because people just don't know. But back to the Black Lives Matter issue, and everyone loves this comment, it was shared that Angela Davis phrased that concept as, when Black Lives Matter, all lives will matter. And I think that everyone has jumped on that and really can get behind that.
That's beautiful. That's exactly.
Most of the rest of them are mostly comments instead of questions.
Great. Okay, super. And, you know, continue to write in the chat and add resources. And if you see somebody ask a question that you know the answer to, go ahead and write it in the chat. So hello, everybody on Facebook. So appreciative that you're with us. Patrice, got burning questions, I take it. Go ahead and ask.
I do. I have several comments as well, but one person is
Uh-oh, you're breaking up a bit.
Of a professional organization and would like, how can we make our professional organization more inclusive? What suggestions do you have?
Okay, so I'll jump in, and Gary, you can kind of piggyback on whatever I don't say. Because as you can well imagine, there's no easy, quick fix. There's no easy, quick answer to that. And in some of the conversations that I've had with people before this call who are asking similar questions like that, and especially for leaders, for executives who are used to making fast decisions, what they want to do with the organization is, okay, we need to do something. Tell me the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things we need to do. And so then tomorrow the culture will change. Human beings don't work like that. So what I would suggest is you really have to look at 3 things. First is you have to do your own personal work. And personal work means be willing to speak up. Silence is not acceptable. So be willing as a leader, when someone says something and you think it's inappropriate or it's racist or whatever, you don't need to put a label on it, and I'm not suggesting you speak up to argue, But you might need to say something like, help me understand why you think that. That's not my experience. Because sometimes just speaking up makes the other person think. And it isn't going to change their mind. We don't need to be about trying to change their beliefs in one conversation. But if enough people start speaking up within your work culture, for instance, then those who truly do think that, you know, as I've heard often, go back to Africa, when I, at that time, had never been there in the first place. Now I've been there several times. But the point is, when they would say that, they will know that there's a critical mass where that's not acceptable anymore. I can't say that anymore. So one is do your personal work so you learn more about differences, and then be willing to speak up. The next is to seriously look at your work culture. Be willing to go beyond awareness training. Now, I do a great deal of bias and unconscious bias workshops and sessions, and then also, of course, the business case of diversity. I do all of that. And what always frustrates me is the number of clients that want me to come in and do a half-day session or a 60-minute keynote. And when I ask them, even before I've presented, and how can we work together, or what will you do to keep this alive so that people actually practice some of the things that I share? Unfortunately for many, that's when their eyes glaze over, because they just want to check a box. So you need to do the awareness, but then you need to go the next step. So that next step is to be willing to look at the systems within your organization that unintentionally are laden with systematic bias. So I'll give you a quick example. If you work for a company that hires engineers and you want the best engineers, very often my clients will say, well, we only want the best. So we're only going to go to Stanford and you know, they'll rattle off several other schools that have very strong engineering programs. And so, you know, we just really can't find any Black people. And so then when I suggest, well, have you thought about North Carolina A&T? Have you thought about Hampton University? They have excellent engineering programs. Well, you know, when you're right in the middle of it, you don't think about it. And especially if you aren't the ethnicity or the race that you're looking for, then they'll say, well, you know, but that's not a top tier school. Well, that doesn't mean it doesn't have top tier students. So you need to be clear about how serious you are in making this change. So that's just an easy one. There's so many. And your team, especially if you have a reasonably diverse team, they can help you with those things. They can identify it. So be willing to listen. And then thirdly, as a leader, be willing to hold people accountable for their inclusion of African Americans. And very few organizations do, unfortunately. There are a couple, and I see some people in the gallery on my screen who I know work for those companies that hold their leaders accountable, not just for the numbers, but truly how inclusive are you? How many people are getting promoted, are being developed? How many are being listened to? Who is your go-to person? So again, it's not a quick fix, but if you start with your behavior and being willing to speak up and pull people in and listen, and then do the next step of helping folks in your organization, starting with leaders so they can hold other people accountable, and then throughout the organization. And if you hold everyone accountable by continuing to teach them ways that they can behave to be better allies, then you'll begin to see some movement. Anything to add, Gary, on that?
Yeah, Lenora, so you were talking about the recruiting situation, and the first thing that came to my mind is, are any of your recruiters African-American? Mm-hmm. Are the African-American cream of the crop from all the schools even seeing somebody that they're attracted to come work for your company in the first place?
Yeah.
So there's that. To me, there's a lot of subtle things that you need to be doing. My mentor, Chris Clark Epstein, always says that if you're going to quote people, make sure you're not only quoting dead white guys. And, you know, I always love that statement, but it always reminds me that the first person I quote, if not my grandma Sarah, is Dr. Maya Angelou. Because A, she was one of the first people that blew my mind with how brilliant she was on the platform. But B, when I read her works, I just found there was so much depth to them. So I always try to quote people that don't look like me.
Yes.
Interestingly, I saw a speaker once who was using a lot of quotes, and the only quote that I saw him use of a minority voice was Dr. Shirley Chisholm, who was an early civil rights leader. I knew of her when I was a kid because she had run for president for the primary when I was a little kid in New York State. But he shared her quote, and then he said, I don't know who she is, but I like the quote. And I thought to myself, you knew who the other people were. You found the quote and you liked it. Wouldn't it have paid to go do some research and find out who she is? And what message were you telling us by saying, I like this quote, but I don't know who this person is? Yeah. And I think it showed a level of disrespect that was unintended, but the white guy that was speaking still showed a lack of awareness.
Yeah. And the one thing many things, but one thing to remember in all of this is we all have good intentions, but people can't read our mind.
That's
and
right.
So intention is not enough. It's the impact. And for leaders who are speaking to their teams on a regular basis, when you start changing your language in a way that says, he knows Maya Angelou, knows a quote, that speaks volumes. It speaks volumes to the people you work with. And one other quick thing, and then I see we have some other questions, and that is another person in this field who is just a thought leader and has written some fabulous books, Howard Ross, and his book, Everyday Bias, believe it or not, a diversity book, went viral when he wrote it several years ago because it was just so well done. I encourage everybody to go out and buy it. I don't get any commission on that, by the way. But he not only does he have research in it, but he has lots and lots of examples of things that we can do and change systematically as well as everyday behavior. And I was able to be in his office one day in Maryland, and he's a white guy, and he's over 6 feet. So he has a very commanding presence when he walks in a room. And in his office, he has a whole wall covered with various people, many very well known and others not so much, who are people of color. Now, and it wasn't just people of color, but from many different walks of life, younger, older, people of color, and European American or Caucasian or white, whichever term you choose to use, all on his office wall. And I asked him why he did that. And he said in his research, what he found, because our neurotransmitters are not hardwired. This I already knew, but it's not hardwired. Some people say, oh, we're born this way. We're not. We can change it if we change our surroundings. And what he said was, just by every day seeing these amazing people, these pictures, even when he wasn't really paying attention, subliminally, it helps change how we view people in their group, whatever that group is. So my question for those of you who are in the work world, when you get back to work, when we're not all working out of our homes again, what does your office look like? What does the artwork look like? Does it represent the people that you want to work for you or the people that already do work for you? Because before I started doing all of this, I worked in corporate America, 2 Fortune 100 companies. And it was quite a long time ago before we were more sensitive about some of these things, but they had amazing European art. Not one thing that was African-American or Native American or Latinx, nothing. And we were in Philadelphia, which is a very diverse place. So that's another way that we can show our inclusion. And by the way, for the immediacy of this moment that we're in our country, what you can do relative to inclusion is to create safe spaces for people to get together and talk. Because not only Black people, but white people are hurting too. There are many people that are hurting right now. And if you as a leader make that space and say, I'm not gonna know all the answers, might not even quite know how to facilitate this, although I know some of you have diversity councils and employee resource groups, that type of thing. figure out a way to have some space, to create some space for people to not have a bitch session, but to share what they're going through and share their feelings. Okay.
And I think that's true on social media as well.
Mm-hmm.
So those of you that are active on Facebook and LinkedIn and Instagram and those other places, if people can know that you're a safe space where they can share what's going on for them and they won't be judged. And by the same token, when someone says something that is egregiously hurtful, and you first check to see if it was intentionally hurtful or not, but then you call it out in a way that is tactful but direct. I think that's really, really important, because what a lot of us have tended to do is we either jump in, trying to box it out, or we back away from it. And I think we need to find that happy medium where we're actually having healthy conversations. We have a woman here in Dallas who started a group called Community Conversations, where she brings people together from all walks of life to just talk. Denise Lee, she's an actress and she's brilliant, but it started 4 years ago and it has slowly dwindled.
Yeah.
And it's because we get comfortable and then we let it go away. And I think we have to not get comfortable. I think that's really, really important.
So I want to go to both Jen and to Patrice for, we have at least one more question from each of them. And then we want to really talk about several actions, and also, again, in the chats, share actions that have worked for you or that you think could work as well. Jen, we'll go with you first.
Okay, what suggestions do you have for talking with family members, for example, parents and grandparents who are white, about white privilege when they don't believe that it exists and feel quite strongly about that?
Gary?
Here's the deal. Most white people don't believe there's such a thing as white privilege. And until we understand that we can only understand our own experience, we're not going to get it. And so I've started to try to learn about it more. I found a video from years ago of this young man who brought together a group of high school or college students and put them on a big field. And he said, I've got $100 bill. The first person who gets to the other side of the field wins the $100 bill. But before we start, if you had if both your parents are still married together, take 2 steps forward. And then he went through this series of questions. If you grew up in a home with a strong father figure, take 2 steps forward. And he got people realizing that a lot of what is privilege for us, we didn't do it. It's not that I did anything, that my parents stayed married for 60 some years. It's just that was something that I had that my friends growing up who were Black may not have had. And that neither of us did it, but I was privileged to have some of those opportunities. And I think when we begin to take away I did something, therefore I have white privilege. I didn't do something. I just am someone who has some who has some opportunities that some of my brothers and sisters who are Black may not have had, and they've had to work harder to get.
I think one of the things that some people are becoming more mindful of during this time is, as we are hearing more stories and as more Black people are sharing their experience very painfully, people are becoming more aware of how we have to think of things that you never have to think about. So for example, I don't have children by choice, but I had a father who was in the military when it was segregated. I have 2 brothers who are much younger than me that I worry about every day. I have a husband that this year I'll be married to him for 47 years. And I live in North Carolina. We live together in North Carolina, but he happens to work in Virginia. And so on his drive to work every day, he has to drive past the largest Confederate flag I've ever seen in my life. That came up that was placed there about 3 years ago. And so Black people have to have conversations with their sons and daughters. Here's what you do if the police pull you over. That is not a time to be in an argument. White people don't have to do that. And so the more that, well, first of all, I would say to you, when you're with your family and they are just absolutely dug in about not believing there's white privilege, again, you're not going to convert them in one conversation. You're not going to convince them that it does exist. But what I would suggest is that you think of circumstances, your own circumstances, where you've done something. Maybe it was going in a grocery store or going in a department store to buy something, and it was just a regular experience. And for a Black person, it doesn't have to be just men, because I've had this happen to me several times, where all of a sudden you see somebody's following you around, a security person. And it's not about being a bad person. It's about, we're all born on this planet. And if you are human and you're breathing on this planet, you cannot not be biased, because we're impacted in so many ways. So oftentimes, and especially with today's social media, is many people only watch one news stream or one channel to get their current events. And if you only read one newspaper, digital these days, if you only read one newspaper, only watch one station, only follow certain things on social media, then of course you're going to think that that's how it is for everyone, when it isn't. And here's another piece. One of the things that I learned a couple of years ago that was really upsetting to me is, as we all started learning more about algorithms and artificial intelligence, is when I put something into Google to look for it, Google's going to remember that. So over time, as I search for things that are even the slightest bit similar, it only sends what it thinks I want. So even if I really want something broad, it's already judging what it thinks I should see. Why? Because human beings write the algorithms, and algorithms have bias built into them. So it's about giving examples and just leaving it there. Again, sometimes you don't, all you have to do is raise the question, gee, it's not my experience. And here's what happens to me when I go in a store versus what happens to other people, and leave it at that. You know, change the subject. You don't have to get in an argument necessarily, but the important thing is silence is not acceptable, to be willing to speak up. Patrice.
That one quick thing, Lenora. There's a word that people are so afraid of, and the word is racism. And so there's this idea of, well, I'm not a racist. Well, if you say you're not a racist, you are clearly a little bit of a racist, because you don't understand that the institution has created racism. And so when I say to somebody I'm not a racist, their first thought is, why would you even have to say that to me unless there's something going on that's saying something different? I think if I can accept that I am a humanist who believes that we are all beautifully, wonderfully a part of this, this planet together, then I don't need to be claiming that I am or am not a racist. I can just start to work together with other people. And I think that's what we need to be doing. And that means we have to broaden our scope. Exactly as Lenora's been saying, broaden it in every way. I sometimes can't post certain things on Facebook because my swath of friends on Facebook is so diverse that I have to be really careful what I post, because I don't want one friend to get upset with what another friend responded to, because I've intentionally done that. I want diversity amongst my community because it helps me to learn.
So Patrice, I'm going to ask you to share a question in a moment. I'm going to share one more thing. We'll answer that question. Then we want to go to some additional how-tos.
Okay.
Hold on one second. I want to make one comment first, because one of the things, just Gary, as you said, you have a very diverse following on Facebook. And so often in the work that I do, I have always tried to say things in the way I said it to myself is I need to say things in a way people can hear it. But I also have realized that there are times when I didn't speak up when I should have. That not to have an argument, but I didn't point things out, or I didn't share a different perspective. And as an African American in this country, it's dangerous to share your point of view sometimes. And that's called covering in the academic world. We cover who we are. So those corporations that say, we want the best talent. First of all, you need to realize that the best talent comes in all kinds of human packages. And secondly, when you say, I want my people to show up and be authentic because I know I'll get their best ideas when they're authentic, then you need to ask yourself, how safe is it in your organization for African Americans to be authentically who they are?
Right.
Because the more we say, oh, you know, Lenora, I don't see your color. The more you say that to me, that more that it says to me is you see how well I've learned how to be in a white culture.
Right.
You're not really seeing who I am always. And I'm not saying you need to, the first thing you see is the color of a person's skin. But the other night on another one of these that I was doing, when someone said, well, you know, you don't say, look at a tree and say, well, I don't see that the leaves are green. Of course we see color. So be willing to see the whole person. Okay, I'm watching the clock, so I'm gonna get one more question and then we'll go to, yes, Gary?
And I've promised to myself that I'm going to speak out and speak up more and not fear offending. I'm going to do it in a way that's tactful, but I know that I need to say what I see so that I can continue to learn.
Yeah, that's what will move the needle, is all of us to find a way that we're always speaking up. Patrice?
Yes, question. Someone wants to know, how can they stay positive when their soul is aching? What can we all do to stay positive?
Yes. As I was talking earlier, because I've been talking to so many people and I want you to keep coming to me. What I realized was I wasn't taking enough time to take care of myself during this time. Now, for those of you who know me, you know I cry easily. I'm comfortable with that. It doesn't mean I'm emotional. It means I'm expressive. But in any case, to answer the question, what I realized I needed to do is to step outside and get some sunshine and just think about all the things I'm grateful for. And it could be some things as simple as, today the sun's shining. Last week, I think it rained every day. So to look for those little things for which we are grateful, to hold our families close. And when I say families, I mean it broadly, because when people often will ask, you know, are you married? Yes. Do you have a family? Well, everybody has a family. I don't have kids, but I have a family, lots of people that I love. So whoever your family is, reach out to them and let them know that you're hurting. And your colleagues as well. So, you know, pick the people who you think would really listen and let them know that you're hurting. And if someone chooses you to reach out to, be willing to listen, be willing to cry with them, be willing to do whatever is necessary so that they can let it out. Because what I know to be true is if you don't let it out verbally in some way, it's going to show up in another way and it won't be pretty. So just make that space. Gary, I knew the time was going to fly. I would like for you to share a few things, and then I'll share some ideas for myself on actions, and then we'll bring it to a close.
Yeah, so, and this is going to both be an action and a piggyback on what you were just talking about, because I had somebody reach out to me last night and say, you know, I posted something on Facebook and I've gotten some nasty texts back, and like, how do I not take it personally, and how do I stay positive? And I wrote something that I thought was really kind of on target for me anyway, and I wanted to share it. I said, change only comes when we try to illuminate what's going on. That's what we're trying to do. Some folks aren't ready, but most of us weren't ready at some point. And it took something, or more often someone, to help us be in a space to learn and grow. And so when I start to get that pushback, and then it starts to affect my emotions and my whole being, I have to remind myself that the struggle that other person is having is a struggle I've had at some point too. And I have to give them space to have the struggle, and then I have to accept it, find something that puts me back into the right space, and then start to share again. And I don't know that it's easy, but I do think it's really, really important. I was on a call, I watched a call just earlier today, and Jess Pettit said something that just struck me to my core. She said, my learning curve takes time. While I'm learning, people are dying. And it hit me that I can't patiently wait to share. I can't wait till I get it just right to share it, because this is happening. And I don't know that this one is any different from all the previous ones, except that this one, we all saw it. It was video, it was shared all over the place. And so we have to start doing something now.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, just
So
need to share that.
I'll start by picking up on Jessica Pettit. She's one of my favorite people too. She wrote a book called Good Enough Now. I encourage you to get the book. And one of the things that she says is, we all make up stories about other people. We can't not do that. You see somebody, you make up a story. So as it relates to Black people, you might see a Black person, a Black man, and you're walking down the street and you automatically hold your purse tighter. So ask yourself why you're doing that. But what she says is, don't beat yourself up because you made up a story and it might have been biased or prejudiced or whatever term you want to put next to it. You're going to make up that story. So what you want to do is, when you make up that story, triple space and use wide margins so you could fill it in with what the reality is for that person and with that person. And I just thought that's such a great visual. I'm going to make up a story, but just fill it, leave yourself enough space and forgive yourself for making up that story. For executives that I know are on this call, several of whom I've had one-on-one conversations with, if you have not already communicated to your team, your employees, your associates in some way, either video, live stream, or in writing, if you have not already done that, you need to do it now. Because everything is changing so quickly that if you wait until next week, many people in your organization, certainly African Americans, many of them are going to think you're late to the party and you're not being genuine. When you communicate with them, what I invite you to do is to allow yourself to be vulnerable. They don't want to hear you really do want African Americans working in your organization and you've got 2 people on your board, and they don't want to hear that. They want to hear, why do you care? So you want to share with them. You don't have to tell them every story in your life, but tell them why to you this is important right now and what you see your culture being. Because I believe that one of the ways to shift the needle and get more people uncomfortable with the status quo is in the workplace, because we spend so much time there. And then when people are moved there, they don't just turn it off when they go home. It changes them at home as well. So communicate to your team and tell your story. Secondly, as a leader, team, associate, or just a human being, be willing to ask people, what's your story? Now, don't walk up to them and say, what's your story? But be willing to say, I really want to know and understand you better. Let's have coffee or not. Let's get to know each other. I'm always fascinated when white people ask me, so how can I make friends with, some of the Black people at work? Well, how do you make friends with white people? It's really the same thing. But you're so afraid you're going to do the wrong thing or say the wrong thing that you end up saying nothing. And what ends up happening when you say nothing is people think you don't care. So it is better to be vulnerable and make a mistake and own it and say, what could I have done differently, than to not say or do anything. So I'm going to share with you an easy to remember mnemonic, and it's B, the letter B, and then the word basic, be basic. And I'll put this on the document that we'll create and then post on Facebook and send out to you, those of you on Zoom. The first B is breathe. Just breathe. So if you're trying to deal with your own stress, there really is something to that meditation, but really breathe. The second B is be willing to be the other. Put yourself intentionally in circumstances where you're the one who is different. So in this case, go out and demonstrate. Even if you're just going to stand on the sidewalk and watch everybody else, to get a sense of what, although that's probably not a good example because the demonstrators are so multicultural, but put yourself in a circumstance, go to a soul food restaurant, I don't know, do something where you're the one who's going to be different. If you have a faith, go to a different place of worship. And all of your stereotypes about what you think are going to happen if you're a white person going to a Black church, guess what? They don't happen. But you become aware of what your own stereotypes are and your biases are. And once you're aware, then you can act on them. The A is ask questions. And when you ask those questions, you can preface it with, this might be a dumb question, but all of you are very brilliant on this call. So, the only dumb question is the one you don't ask. So you might even approach it with, I've got a question. It's probably a dumb question, but I really don't know. I really just would like to understand. And then ask the question. Now, some people are going to get tired of answering questions. Like some of my Black female friends are tired of explaining to people why they should not put their hands in their hair when they've got, braids or dreads or what have you. You can compliment it and say that, what a nice hairstyle, and tell me how it works, but don't say, oh, nice hairstyle, and put your hand in your hair. This happens all the time. I know I'm looking at some of your faces like, really? But this really does happen. So ask the questions. Be willing to be vulnerable and ask the questions. Then the S stands for stop your judgment. So stop your judgment. So that essentially is another way is to just, be present, hear what's happening, and not judge the person based on how they carry themselves and all of that kind of thing. The I stands for invite others. Now, in the workplace, you might have a reasonably diverse workplace, but when you have a dinner party, who's there? Do you ever invite people who don't look just like you? Now, don't invite just one person who looks different than you, but mix it up. You'll be amazed at how it impacts the conversation with the people that you invite over. The C stands for check your ego at the door, because we always want to be right. Put your ego at the door. Go in knowing I don't know what I don't know, and I want to know more, and then be present. So those are things you can do personally. Then just in developing your own understanding. Then the other things that you can do, again, and the two of us have said it in one way or another several times, is silence isn't acceptable. So find a way to speak up. Again, not to attack the other person. And usually what works is asking a question. Help me know why you think that. Help me understand. So something, whatever's going to work for your personality, but be willing to speak up. And then sometimes speaking up, stuff is just wrong. And you just have to point that out. Certain things are just wrong.
Can I share one thing with that, Lenora,
Yeah,
before we
please.
wrap up?
Go ahead.
So when you're doing that, be careful of the words, I understand how you feel, or
Yeah.
I've been there, because those, although meant well, aren't received the way you think they are, because you haven't been there and you don't really understand. You can try to appreciate, but you don't understand. So be careful of words that you know are meaningfully, intentionally good, but could actually kind of offset what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah. And if you do say it, then just catch yourself in that moment and say, well, wait a minute. No, I know I don't understand.
But still ask.
Yeah, still ask. So what I ask of you is to continue to share your comments, your questions, and resources that you might have. This was too short for us to identify a lot of resources. So I want to share a sad fact with you, and then something to think about. And then also let us know not only if you would like this to continue, but what specifically you would like us to focus it on. This event was not just an event, the event. I'm talking about George Floyd. It really was a culmination of many things that have happened. And some people don't want to believe that racism is still alive and well. As of 2019, there were 940 hate groups. 55% increase in white supremacist groups since 2017. 55%. So you may be talking to somebody who you think thinks like you do, and they don't. This is real. What I share with you in the other direction is Ubuntu. It's a Zulu proverb that I learned on one of my many trips to South Africa. Ubuntu means I am because you are. You are because I am. I believe if all of us, regardless of the color of our skin, would be willing to do the work, to be courageous, to find ways to speak up, we will lift everyone up. Thank you so much, those of you on Facebook. Thank you, everybody on Zoom. And thank you so much, Mandy, Jen, and Patrice, who were watching everything for us. And Gary, again, thank you so very much. Bye, everyone.
It was nice to see so many of you on here that I know.
Yes.